This video was sponsored by Squarespace, a website platform for people who've got plans in digital spaces, young or old. They'll be able to make a site for all their needs. Oh look, I have many different lums here, so many images, but nowhere to put them until I use Squarespace's custom galleries. So many options for how I put them there, and of course you have universal asset uploading, so as soon as I upload all these files, usually up to 20 megabyte files that is, so I can move them, adjust them, put them wherever I want, including on links like this. See, now this is also a lum. You have so many visual design tools to make the domain yours. If you want a constant change, or just something for that specific page to make it special, font, color, animation, you can use your imagination. So check out Squarespace for your free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to www.squarespace.com/STEVEM to get 10% off your first purchase, website, or domain. Let's get on to the video. Mamoru Oshii, an inspiring filmmaker, 26, broke, unemployed. Just like the Japanese film industry. No studios were hiring, so he had time to spare. In 1977, Oshii would wander through the streets of Kokubunji, where he'd bumped into a telephone pole with a flyer attached to it, hiring positions for the anime industry, Tatsunoko. A familiar name Oshii remembered from Gatchaman reruns, a series that left enough impact on him to apply, though not like he had a choice. At the time, Oshii was a film graduate and newlywed, who bounced between dodgy job to job. Well, during the same time, it was the late 70s, which was the beginning of the animation boom in Japan, and many anime studios were understaffed, even to the point of hiring people with no experience. Maybe that would go well for Oshii.
I've seen all your films. Oh, and I can edit film.
Can you storyboard?
They asked. Yeah. Oshii didn't really know that much about storyboarding, only doing a little bit during his student days. But despite it all, he was hired, joining the editing team, spending his early days photocopying and throwing out the trash. But his aspirations were higher. Oshii wanted to aim right for the top. So when I first saw an anime director, my impression was he was young, wearing cotton pants, a t-shirt, and sandals. He was dressed so sloppily. I thought, maybe I can do this too.
He was introduced to the chief director, Hiroshi Sasagawa. Sasagawa told him if he wanted to be a director, he needed to drop a storyboard within 1 week. This would be his turning point. It wouldn't be easy, but he finished it. Now, Sasagawa wanted him to draw the real deal for Yatterman. He became his assistant for the next month. Then, several months after joining Tatsunoko, Oshii had graduated from binman, boarder, all the way to directing staff. He wasn't the only one. Tatsunoko had hired 4 young staff, all relatively inexperienced. They also became known as the 4 Heavenly Kings. The freshest of them would be Oshii.
The last director I directly supervised was Mamoru Oshii. He always had something different from others, and he always gave each work his own Oshii style. Even in making a single gag, he had a way of making it through calculation and logic.
Sasagawa gave him the fundamentals, while other members like Mashimo often helped with his storyboards. Both had an interest in the same kind of filmmaking, but it was Hisayuki Toriumi who became Oshii's mentor at the studio, the director behind the original Gatchaman, which caught his eye. He was a stern master, blunt with people who didn't live up to his standards, but Oshii needed something like that. He had learned how to do things quick and fast out of necessity, and yet he needed to commit to doing things properly to become, in his mind, a real director. Toriumi was the person to give him the right philosophy. He was more loyal to Toriumi than Tatsunoko, as the studio was having an exodus with many of their top talent leaving, and they would be courted by a new studio, Pierrot, created by one of Tatsunoko's alumni, Yuji Nanakawa. Oshii and his mentor would play starring roles at the studio with The Wonderful Adventures of Nils, Pierrot's first show, an adaptation of a Swedish novel funded by the publisher Gakken. Back in the 70s, Japan would release all manner of variety of Western novel anime, many which went on to be big successes. Nils had a strong team to try and recreate that.
Oshii became the most active episode director on the series. It was a tough show to work on, with them using beyond 8,000 drawings per episode, pretty much twice the standard. This series would be a study course for the young director, and it was one full of complex animal motions and creative uses of perspective, including trying to get the most out of his shrunken protagonist. It did take Oshii a long time to get an idea of what he was doing beyond a technical standpoint. After all, his first storyboard took about a month to complete. But towards the end, Oshii brought his own variations to the show. The shots were tighter, with more intricate layers, and there was a focus on his cinematic background, as he tried to simulate camera techniques.
なんだてめえは。
まあ美味しそうなガーチョ。
おい、強そうなのが2羽もいるじゃないかよ。
何言ってんだよ今さら。
But things were about to change with the next Pierrot show, Urusei Yatsura. Despite it being a relatively popular shonen manga, it was hard to get the animation off the ground. Cue Kitty Film. Kitty Film was not a standalone company, it was a subsidiary of the music publisher Kitty Enterprises. Music would therefore play a large role of Urusei Yatsura. It was Kitty Film producer Shigekatsu Ochiai who chose Animation Studio Pierrot for this assignment. He just liked Nils so much that he wanted to work with them.
They still need a station, and coincidentally, Fuji TV might have them covered. Every Wednesday at 7:30 p.m, they played 1000 Nights of Stars. It was a talk show form that was about to be cut, and hopefully Urusei Yatsura could take that slot just after Dr. Slump, which was doing very well in the ratings. They were hoping to capitalize and compete. The popularity of Urusei Yatsura manga was booming. From that young Rumiko Takahashi, they'd already sold 2 million units, which was speeding up that whole process of trying to get a deal. That did help the anime project going forward, but the talks sort of slowed down and it got to about a razor's edge when it really didn't know which way it would go. Pierrot had to make a decision. If they didn't start now, they'd never hit airing, so they had 3 months to make something of Urusei Yatsura before it potentially will air, which is about half the time you'd usually get on a series to start with your pre-production. But in the end, they did snatch that slot. The debut would be October 14th at 7:30 p.m. and they described it as city sci-fi. The universe is warm, what makes you feel happy and refreshed somehow. They wanted it to be some kind of intergalactic rom-com that appealed to everyone. Maybe even younger than the people who read the manga, as they introduced Tenchan much earlier than they are in the original source material. The staff were also young, just like the author. Many of the veterans were working on Mysterious Cities of Gold, which was Oshi's mentor's new project, leaving Urusei Yatsura to a lot of first-timers, including the director, Oshi. Being an employee, I had no say in the matter, but the people around me seemed surprised by it. I'd only been working in anime for 4 years at that point, so I believed it was an unusual case. It would usually take longer to transition to head director. Oshi had only been in the studio for about a year. So why now? Well, character designer Takada said if Oshi was known for anything during this period, it was keeping up to schedule and budget, which would definitely be helpful for such a series that needed to be rushed into production. The team would already be suffering that aftermath, working day and night before the first episode would even air. And what an opening that was. Well, straight away Oshi made some enemies at Fuji TV. In particular, one producer, Tadashi Oka. He was the TV general producer and he knew he was not going to like this man. He described him as a quiet boy with messy hair and a dirty jacket. One day he saw the storyboard for the first episode, which involved the unveiling of Lump's breasts, and he told him straight away, you need to cut that or at least trim it down to about half a second so no one can see anything. Oshi responded with something along the lines, oh, it's okay. It was not okay. Oshi exposed Lump's breast to the entire nation on a primetime slot at 7:30 p.m. at night, causing all matter of chaos for the television studio, including a lot of people calling them up and a personal inquiry that came with that. And it wasn't the last time that Oshi would break any rules, I'll tell you that much. Now, when Oka told Oshi what he had done, he simply responded with a smirk. Even outside episode 1, it was kind of a rough start for the production. Not only was it, only given about half the time it should have beforehand, it was definitely rougher than some of its contemporaries. Not to mention, they were changing the format in such a way where every issue became a 10-minute episode, splitting the series into chunks. At first they were hoping that would keep up with the sort of sporadic nature of the show, but it ended up basically meaning that they could only do certain kind of episode formats and that they had to cut stuff, and they already weren't following the source material, and that was pissing off fans, even back then. Letters of protest, direct complaints, there was quite a lot of cassettes that were sent in. I think anyone who was involved in directing can understand that the more you try to make changes based on such opinions, the more you end up not being able to meet those needs. It's not a creative situation. But to an absurd degree as well, because they were responding with a lot of venom. They were sending razor blades, hate mail, and cassette tapes full of slurs all the way to the post. And it didn't seem to be getting much better because while Dr. Slump was hitting 35%, episode 1 of Urusei Yatsura could barely break 18% on the ratings. If they could, they would have fired Oshi, but they knew at the very least that without him, the team wouldn't follow their orders. And if they had fired him, it would be the end of his career because you can't take this incredibly successful manga and turn it into an anime show? You're dead weight. The crew was so much on Oshi's side, they constantly stood by him, which caused a very back and forth between the producers when they'd say, don't do this, and they'd say, we only follow the director's rules, and then he goes to the director and he says, I only follow the crew's rules, pretty much making it a stalemate. But it came from an experience that Oshi had with his mentor, who told him, you should never leave your desk, which basically means as long as you're in the room, the producers can't come in and mess with stuff.
But it slowly turned in Oshi's favour. Over the coming weeks, ratings surged to 23% plus. Episode 10 was the first episode that didn't split itself into 2 parts, and is still a fan favourite to this day. It was reflective of the Christmas atmosphere, that late season, with Oshi boarding the episode, and it brought a sort of melancholy that complemented its comedy, with its stark framing with high shots and an emphasis on solitude and blinding backlights. Oshi wanted to focus on the limitations to contrast the scene, if that be his postcard memories or longer cuts. See, Oshi likes to fill out the cuts. He wants less of them, only cutting when it's valid to do so, not cutting because someone else is talking. This process could take more frames for those sequences because you have to show every motion, but they plan to cut any unnecessary fat from the story anyway. This approach would just not be conventional, but nothing really about the series was. I wanted to do something reckless, or rather I wanted to try something novel. I gathered a group of young people and made them do whatever they wanted, almost unconditionally. The terrible ones were terrible, but we also created works with an overwhelming sense of power that would never be possible if we had done things the usual way. The team were also full of young otaku, so while the show was pitched for everyone, it did become one of the earliest in the field to appeal to that new burgeoning demographic, even with people on staff being military maniacs, increasing the amount of tanks, planes, and spaceships all around. Episodes also became Easter egg rich for different pop culture references. And it was all done with a relatively few credited key animators per episode, which meant they could go on for longer and trying to express themselves with each of their different ways of doing things. Even if there was a ton of animation issues during the early part of the series, it's very inconsistent and the character art is often falling apart. Episodes could have standout cuts, but the aesthetic left something to be desired. The team do start building up some more ambitious energy around episode 14, which is the first appearance of Masahito Yamashita, and that's when we start to develop a particular type of dynamic approach. Erratic bold movements with striking storyboards to sell the absurdity on display. It was all reminiscent of a certain artist, Yoshinori Kaneda. It makes sense because Yamashita was one of his disciples. Who is Kaneda? Well, he was the coolest animator around, and it was all about freedom of expression with his approach. There was no basic limited animation here. He'd variate the number of drawings to mix up the timing and tempo, and often would not use in-betweeners, doing it all himself. You could see elaborate races and chases, explosions, lasers, pushing the perspective and poses. He was definitely a rock star in the animation world, and he had a fan club, and I don't doubt a lot of those animators ended up on the show. Because of the invention of the relatively new VHS recorder, it's never been easier to break down something frame by frame. Not only did that help develop the foundation of otaku when it comes to archiving shows they care about to discuss further, it also meant that they could use VHSs to learn about their favourite animators, and through that the Kaneda school arose. Not all from the self-taught, but those who worked under him in his many different studios. Urusei Yatsura's kitchen sink approach meant anything goes after all. Just look at episode 22. Oshi boarded and directed that one, and it probably does have some of the strongest talent on display that we'd seen so far. It was full of a lot of energy, with animation bursting with personality, going beyond just a character sheet. Especially in the second half, where you have layers of colours and space, with bold shadows, cold neons. It's very 80s. It just melts into that science fiction setting, effortlessly spinning past spaceships while shuffling through its strongest cuts. What starts as general highlights blooms into a closer norm to the show. If we look at something like episode 29, it creates a chase to end all chases, going on for so long and so wild in a high effort for really something that is quite stupid in the end, but I guess that's part of the joke.
Really, I can't help but be impressed. It kind of knocked me off my socks in a way. It just comes out of nowhere. I don't even know how you would write or board such a sequence, or if that just evolved from the staff's creativity. The director, Kaiji Hayakawa, was also another one of the disciples of the Kanda school, so it's not outside the realms, it definitely is in Yamashita's wheelhouse.
Oshii was from an era where the screenplay was more just about the dialogue. In fact, his master had once said that's all it should be for. All the other decisions in terms of how the scenes connect, or what it looks like, or the interiors, the environment, should all be decided by the storyboarders or the directors, in his opinion. As the series went on, the team certainly turned a corner when it came to animation, and it started to really smooth out, let's say. And the series momentum kept going as well, rarely going under 15% in the ratings, maxing out about 24%, which it's not hitting Dr. Slump levels, but it's not bad. Well, Oshii had a thing about anime. He said that a successful anime can have so-so animation. That's fine. Urusei Yatsura didn't have to worry about that at first. But if the cast was mediocre, then you can't have a hit. And it's very lucky then that the cast was superb and very iconic, and were basically the things that kept it going. They gave him so many long speeches and soliloquies to fire out of the audience. It must have been hard to breathe.
何が彼女をそう導いた？すべては母たる彼女の内よりほとばしる母性愛によるものであったのだ。しかし、
俺はやだ！そんな隠し事なんてそんなあの人に限って不道徳な理不尽だ！許さん！絶対に許さん！
Director would say at least that half the reason the show was so big is those voice actors. It might not beat Slump's ratings, but it was definitely defining cultural revolution in other places, strengthening the culture of things like comiket, of fan culture, scenes and cosplays. It rapidly expanded during Lum's rise, as she became an icon of such places. Patrick Galbraith once called her the first pin-up girl of anime.
Oh, Patrick! Check out that cute maid!
Moe. Oh, she's Moe. I'm digging it.
She was very popular, a character that defined the era, with Animage's charts putting her at the top of female characters for the entire TV run. Even before they separated the character polls, she was second place in 1981, and even ranking third in Animage's top heroines of all time by 87 when the show was pretty much off the air. But yes, outside of Otaku, we know that Urusei Yatsura had its detractors, although some of the producers and team had started moving to respond in some ways, if only minorly, from the continuous two-parters of every episode, which left very little time to fill in every part of the story.
Some of the early stuff was a little meandering. They don't develop past the initial premise and eventually destroying Atsuru's house. Very funny. But you don't really have time to.
Well, for episode 22 onwards, they were no more two-parters. They were all full-length episodes. It already worked for episode 10 and 22 after all. But yet with this new format, there was a bit of a shake-up. The head writer, Yu Yamato, left the production out of the blue. The young Katsunori Ito became the new head writer, going on to be Oshii's long-term ally.
Frankly, this was another rough transition for the staff as they readjusted. What we get later on is when we start to evolve the stories to mature or add more character drama and just represent the sensibilities of the crew and their influences more so. Sometimes that involves mixing and matching chapters and moving the story around because they never quite followed it in order to begin with. Sure, it works, but there are definitely times when there's some hurt characterization, because while the manga is pretty episodic, it does move, and the show's pick and choose approach doesn't always work. For episode 22, those chapters encompass 97 to 100. The next episode reverts all the way back to chapter 14. Episode 22 is somewhat of a landmark in Atsuru's characterization as he bids to save Lum, and it also establishes, at least in this episode, that Shinobu had kind of dumped him by this point. The early dynamic of the love triangle was effectively over. Well, that is until the next episode, and they're both back trying to find a way away from Lum and back together again, like it's the beginning of the early chapters. Yeah, and Otsuru is absolutely a worm who does not commit, and the Oshii team really love pushing that, but there is a little bit of a change in that dynamic. And at the very least, the writers do start to lean into that further, expanding on the source material at points, and sort of coming to their own conclusion.
Though I would say by the mid-30s, I think the animators and writers got a lot of weird sakuga flexes and ingenuitive creativity now ingrained with the language of the show, especially with how the crews adapt and change the material. The first year of the production was kind of all over the place, but it was starting to look a little bit more optimistic, with the show hitting another peak at episode 44, going on to be voted the nation's favourite episode of the series not once, but twice. Another Arthur and Lum relationship episode, which tend to be some of the more popular ones. It was around this time the show hit its best consistent ratings. The fan hate had kind of simmered down, and they'd accepted this wasn't going to be Takahashi's version. Maybe it's something I can say now, but I think I was able to convince Rumiko Takahashi fans, the manga fans. I spent a year and a half doing it without giving up. I guess I can say that now.
But with success comes expectation, and then this deadly ideas from one of the manga editors, why don't we do a theatrical animation alongside the animated TV show? Yeah, that will go well. But it doesn't stop there, there was another problem that came along with that. The original director quit, which meant that they wanted Oshii to do it while also directing the TV show, which he at first was absolutely going to refuse. It took his mentor Toriumi to pretty much convince him that if he didn't do it, someone else would ruin it. We'll get back to the video in a moment. So this is part of my Mamoru Oshii series that I'm hoping to make, and it's going to be easier said than done because I want to cover everything he's done and do it in pretty intense detail, which is why I'm really grateful for the people who've been supporting me on Patreon to make the series. For this video in particular, I did about 40 illustrations of Oshii through this sort of time period. It was a lot, and I also made this little guide to do it, because I want to focus down on sort of like the boarding and the angles, so I thought it'd be good to have a little 3D model, but he's kind of also falling apart, so I might need to remake him to keep using him. And hopefully at some point I'll also make an exclusive video on some of the cancelled Oshii titles, which I would hope to put on Patreon, strictly for those viewers who've been supporting the project. And right now I believe the Dalos project, which is the second part in the series, is already on Patreon, so if you're watching this and you want to see it, you can support straight away. And we already have quite a lot of new supporters that I should really give my appreciation to. These are the $10 patrons that I'm going to bring up, and all the $5 ones are behind me. So that we're going to start with Pedro Ferreira, Waj, R.G. Palmer, Kitty Cat, Graham, Oscar Britton, George O, Luger, Ian Laser, Curtis Barhurst. I'm sorry if I'm getting some of these wrong. I'm not very good at pronouncing names. Alexander Safronov, Pong, and going back to the classics, Lenny, Tim James Richard, Stratogen,
Stratos,
Chunks, Jay, Foxmorder, Oti, Paul, Demon's Mum, Subsofa, Systematic, Karen, Nick, Doji, Peter, Yegor, Vic Boss, DTB, Gambaroni, Julius Roth, Alf, SD, Mickey Moan, for your continuing support of the project, and I hope everyone is enjoying the franchise as we go forward, because it's going to be a lot of work. Only You seemed to originally be nothing more than like a short franchise film. There's a lot of those during the 80s, and they usually were maybe capped at like an hour, part of double features, and they'd be a fun little non-canonical ride. But this one grew a bit too much for their liking, turning into an 80-minute behemoth, and it's not exactly Oshii's first rodeo with this. Back in the day, there was also a Nils movie which wasn't released at first. It was kind of shelved, but it effectively retold the entire series in 90 minutes or less, and that wasn't with just chopping the animation up. They did all the animation again from scratch, which is really a shame that they never got to actually show it theatrically back in the 80s. With Only You, the author had approved some sort of draft script that they gave to Oshii, and he was a bit horrified. He looked at it and thought, this is not good at all. And when he asked for corrections, well, apparently the screenwriter already went off to Paris, so they couldn't give them anyway. But effectively, he had a very small amount of time to make the adjustments himself and create a whole feature film. One which he saw as a sort of flimsy backdrop with 1,001 cameos, just to fill a kind of quota. Many of these parts of the project were kind of out of Oshii's control, including the request by Kitty Film to include 3 musical sequences within the movie. They felt a bit like filler sequences in the end. Though it's not like there weren't a couple music sequences within the show, but they tended to be a bit more harmonious with the structure of the episode, where the ones in the movie kind of just feel like they're padding out the experience. Well, sounding music was part of the game for Kitty Film, and many of the Musical releases of Urusei Yatsura would end up in the top 10 of the Oricom charts, so I guess they were doing their job. Not only did the show have a catchy OP and ED, it had a habit of changing them in rotation. While OP1 lasted about 77 episodes, during that time they had 4 whole EDs. The sound of the actual show kind of differed and focused on a more synthetic score for a modern age, which wasn't quite as usual back then, and that is something that the movie continued to do, as they began to use a Fairlight, which was the ancestor of the sampler. It was very expensive back then. It became a central part of the music production, giving a little variance to the instrumentation they could use within the movie. There was a chaotic mashup quality to the movie as it pushes through space opera action next to rom-com antics.
Yeah, the setting was absolutely falling apart before our very eyes, gratuitous in its mecha chaos, dabbling in the explosive Masahito Yamashita's role as mecha designer among other things. There were no intense battle scenes, so I'm the supporting actor. I will be in charge of 40 key cuts. In the second half of the movie, mecha will appear, so I will be in charge of some of those designs as well. When it starts cooking, it roasted the whole damn thing. The film revels in the Canada-style animators without the limits of TV animation holding them back, and they were just adding people and objects all over the place to the chaos. Especially when you consider this movie was in a cinematic widescreen. It was produced in both ratios at the same time, so you could get it on home release and theatre. Now, I'm not exactly going to say the shot compositions come off amazing in the theatrical version. They do feel a bit more natural within the 4x3. Sometimes they feel a bit cropped with the theatrical release, which is a shame because that is probably now the most preserved version of the movie. But there are also issues with having to cut content from the film. So the movie went about 40 minutes longer than they thought it should have, which is a problem when it's a double bill. So in the end, Oshii had to scrap about as much as he could, which was all finished animation, which is a real waste. I mean, usually you don't finish the animation before you make a decision like that, but I guess things were a bit messy. In particular, they had to just redo the entire opening. A young Koji Morimoto had done a very interesting avant-garde display, which also took full hold of the instrumentation of the Fairlight. It fits also in line with Oshii's aesthetic, but in the end this wasn't really his film as much as it was the producer's.
It wasn't just about the struggling production, but Oshii's own home life. Oshii's wife was pregnant those days, and they'd even bought a new house recently, but work had brought him away from his family and had caused many fights. Even though he knew it was the worst decision, he decided to run away to the studio and stayed there for weeks on end. The stench must have been unimaginable.
He was feeling lower than low, and his mentor Toriumi had to say to him, "Look, you failed as a husband, you failed as a father, you're the worst guy now, but there's only one thing left for you. That's the film. You have to do your best with the film." He was very much overworked to the ground, and yet he still hated the results. It was just an extended episode of the TV, he'd say. Shortly after the movie was completed, he was divorced and later forfeited custody of his daughter. He might have been hitting an emotional low, but his name recognition was actually not. He gained quite a bit of traction in the industry from the movie, leading to an infamous interview with Hayao Miyazaki. Oshii was staring at God, as he would put it, and he wasn't exactly what he was expecting. He was really merciless. I was told many harsh things. So I ended up with the impression like, what a son of a bitch. Miyazaki wasn't pulling punches, even though if he appeared nice before the conversation started. When it came to Only You, he was pretty savage, backing Oshii into a corner. He had to pull out some excuses, he was only given 4 months, which, understandable, so was Miyazaki with Castle of Cagliostro. In the end, you would just have to focus on finishing the movie. Others were far kinder, like his own mentor who gave words of encouragement after all that mess, and the author would clap and cheer for the movie, considering it one of their favourites. It was also a box office success, for what they considered to be a success at least, and successful enough that the producers wanted to make an extended cut where they'd add back all those old shots. Now this is back in the old days though, so they had to go back into the lab and splice them back into the movie. The extended cut was really only released on laserdiscs, and by the end Oshii felt like it was a complete waste of time. He thought it was too long at 80 minutes. Even if he personally believed Morimoto's opening was better, he didn't think this was his cut, it was more of the, once again, producer's cut. The series grew with Only You's success, gaining new animators along the way, but from the experience on that movie, Oshii's aspirations had taken a new form, having the motivation to go further than ever before. As the style of the show develops, they could pretty much do whatever they wanted. As the staff said, the second year was a lot of fun, because things could get weird, with episode 53, which was produced towards the end of the first movie's production. the show gets very different in tone and atmosphere, almost eerie and quiet, playing on a sense of optical illusion, making it unlike any prior episode. The majority of the first half of the episode is completely anime original, before it pulls back to something from the manga, jumping between this sort of more atmospheric and eerie to a raunchy slapstick, imaginative setup. There's a line between these traditional Japanese myth interconnected with high science fiction. The clash of cultures is kind of part of the show, but the series is pushing it even beyond that, moving away from that kind of strictly comedy edge, especially when we start to see a lot more of those original stories. From episode 70 onwards, we start to see banger after banger, including 3 original episodes, which are all standouts in the series. Episode 75 in particular going down as one of the nation's favourite when it comes to those anime originals, completely changing the premise to a classic murder mystery, which doesn't play pretty much 99% of it for a gag at all. There's stellar boarding and some really dramatic and more subtle animation than you usually see. They were committing to different stylistic flares, and you can't really talk about commitment without bringing up episode 78. Even in this era of freedom, Oshii had landed himself in some hot water. He was called into the office of Fuji TV to be told not to publish the episode, but Oshii pushed back until there was no time to make anything else. Reluctantly, it was sent to air. This was episode focused on the inner psyche of Otaru's mother, a character that at that point had very little spotlight. Once more, there's basically no comedy in this episode. It's completely cerebral, and a mystery that basically never has an answer. It might as well have been a different show, which is why it gained such a divisive response, because it was not what you expected to see on that 7:30 slot. But over the years, it has definitely gained its following, enough to land in the top 10 of NHK's recent episode poll. But even if they warned Oshii, there was nothing really they could really do to stop him at this point. The animators were pretty secure in having a good time, and as staff had changed and moved, the designs themselves had sort of warped over time to better represent where the talent were. Episode 29 seemed like a one-off novelty maybe at one point, but now we can throw an insane chase every couple of episodes. The types of animators that were drawn to the show is almost legendary when you read them all out loud. Take an episode like 47, we have the late Mutsumi Inomata, the master of the battle bikini and the powerhouse animator of the Kanda School, next to Hiroyuki Hitakuba, soon to be the director of Black Magic, on top of someone like Shinji Otsuka, who is Ghibli's future finest animator. Oh yeah, can't forget Yuji Moriyami, who'd go on to be the animation director and character designer of Project A-ko. It's a who's who of 80s animation icons, or ones that might be soon. Not to mention, there's so much core staff just flexing. At this point, look, Motosuke Takahashi, he and his small team were animating from episode 1, but over time they kind of just pushed further into their own kind of vibe, taking on many roles in the production and excelling at it all. This Takahashi came from Tatsunoko, and he was moving across Pierrot around the same time as Oshii. He was also an episode director on Nils, and you could see that he was even back then focused on cartoony exaggeration, a sort of slapstick and fun, emphasis on bigger eyes and physicality. There's no better episode to represent that than episode 59, with smears and exaggeration to the point that you might as well not have a character sheet anymore. It was the opposite side to the Kanda School we saw affecting the show, going towards something that's a bit more Bugs Bunny with the mallet. And it all comes to a combination in episode 84, where you see a kind of mixture of both of these schools in something about evil invading potatoes, which I don't know if I could make up myself. And yeah, that's another original. This show really could be anything, I wasn't joking. But there was now one limit upon the show. When discussing a second movie production, the producers specifically told Oshii, don't do anything like episode 78 for that movie. Oshii would laugh, because that was exactly his plan.
Movie 2 starts in a similar way. First they try and bring Takahashi in to write a script, but it doesn't go right, she's too busy. And then there's a new screenwriter brought on. And he'd also happened to see the director in a record store once. He was trying to buy Godard's Alphaville,
which brought fears into him about him being into sort of the French New Wave. He was the type of guy that Shoto did not like, and in the end of the day, Oshii did not like his script and they parted ways. The original rejected script seems a bit closer to something you would see in episode 105 and 106, which is more about amnesia and trying to get Lum back. There were a lot of problems with the script over the half a year, give or take, until they just scrapped it all and Oshii decided to write his own version. So Oshii started to pitch a plot that the producers actually quite liked, just so he could get the green light and start the production. He couldn't actually make a full script in that time, but he decided to make it out in little memos, which took about a month to fill in. He spent some time reducing the cast and moving parts around to create something that could stand out with his limited resources and funds. An idea popped into his head about something he'd like to do in high school. It's centered around ruins and dreams. It still wouldn't be easy though. When Ochai did see the storyboards, he was mortified. Oshii had lied to him about the story. It was not what was signed off, and he said in that moment, "I wish I could take these storyboards and disappear." Oshii would not give an inch. He would force the production to slow motion if he didn't do what he said. It was time for him to act a little megalomaniac-esque, you could say. This might be his last rodeo. It almost seems like a response to what Miyazaki was saying to Oshii in a lot of ways, about how flimsy the setting was of the prior movie. The director had learnt a lot from that first movie, but he was looking for a rematch this time on his terms. The first problem came with the form. Oshii had a lot of problems with the original movie for being an extended episode of a TV show, but how do you make animation cinematic? Well, in a conversation with one of the other Heavenly Kings, he would liken anime more to a theatrical play than a movie, saying there are things behind the scenes that the audience can't see. Just as the viewer understands we're watching a play, the viewer has to kind of give in to the fiction. Anime, in its own way, is a flat space, just like a stage show which is slapping down its backdrop. And Beautiful Dreamer takes that in mind. There's a lot of tableaus of characters where they kind of let the actions speak for themselves over the location. Just like a theatrical play, they try and create layers of illusion with a lot of prop cells, a lot of stuff in the scene which won't actually move, which has been painted on just to give the illusion that it might do at any time. While film and anime are not comparable, how do you make an anime for the silver screen? Oshii would consult the school of Osamu Dezaki. He'd watch movies like 1979's Aim for the Ace, a retelling of the tennis anime itself, but the way it approaches things was different, much bigger. He specifically refers to a scene in the movie with a helicopter shot, which rejects real time for a more abstract time, something that reflects more the mood and tone of the characters' relationships. As the blades glide slowly, there is no reality to be on the screen, things that would be much harder to achieve on film. And it's sometimes everything but the animation that can make a scene feel a certain way. Oshii believes you need other people who understand your vision. For Dezaki, he brings up people like Shichiro Kobayashi, a legendary art director who's worked with pretty much everyone. So he thought, why not just bring in the same art director, huh? Kobayashi joins the team. While defining the aesthetic of this world, he supervises all the background painters while setting the tone, as he would say himself.
私はですね、やっぱり美術監督という全体の背景美術全体を統括する、作品ごとにこのスタイルを決めまして、世界観ですね、その作品の世界観に合った、独自なスタイルを常にこう作り出すこと。
While he may paint some of himself, he's mainly there to make sure it all keeps consistent and follows the right aesthetic, which is pretty strong within the movie. He sets up the fractured world. If the prior movie was considered kind of a lack of setting, this one is more or less all the setting. The setting is the story. Moreover, there's a fair change in the color palette. Blue, turquoise, spotlighting. We have warm window lights. It's a very lonely setting with lots of dark nights and blinding skies. It's about how you process those shots too, not just the backgrounds. That's when you have to talk about photography direction. It's something that the team is really focused on here. Aim of the Ace also creates the illusion of cinescope with lens flares and slight motion blurs, characters running across the camera, where Beautiful Dreamer does something similar, but it tries to add more layers. It's almost a feeling of the 3 different positions within the camera, but that's not really the same in animation, so you must create the fantasy of a lens, which is where the photography department comes in. It's a skill upon itself. There are effects added to every frame which often add depth or the illusion of movement in tiny little details. Is an attempt to enhance the aesthetic of a neon-drenched street or a blazing hot day, trying to push what you can do when it comes to layers of focus. In the show, you can see that Oshii is very interested in these things, but the movie tries to focus even further on that, especially with how it's composed. There's an old saying by Ridley Scott about if you want to make the scene come together, you can kind of add a bunch of rain, smog and big flashing lights to sort of block out, especially when you're talking about special effects, which is all present here. But really what brings those shots together more than anything is the layouts, which will focus down on storyboards. These are probably some of Oshii's most meticulous storyboards to this point. Framing is so important. Drawing the eye line to the boxes, focusing on splitting the landscape, with each shot operating for its own kind of unique energy. There are moments of animatism that break through the shot, especially in its widescreen, which this movie itself is much better suited to. You can even see it in the storyboards. It's made for it. Even in bringing just a lot of more avant-garde and high conceptual ideas to the frame. The shots in this movie are probably some of the longest Oshii's done in his career, which is a career of pretty long shots, all things considered. He's really bringing that idea of less cuts to its natural conclusion. There are only 633 in the entire movie, 200 less than Only You, despite being roughly around the same length. Take for example that year's Nausicaa. That had about 1,570 cuts, which is more than twice that of Beautiful Dreamer. So yes, this is probably the beginning of Oshii playing the scenes as long as he physically can, focusing on the composition over anything else, which may be a resource thing, but also when they need it, they have it. When you think of something like the tank shot, it's one of the most iconic in the movie. It's about 18 seconds long and you really get to breathe it in comparison to the prior sequence, which is 10 shots in 30 seconds. It's sporadic and disorientating, which we know statistically the rest of the movie is not going to be that quick. The layouts, the compositing, the backgrounds, everything kind of comes together to, in the end, put a shine on those core members of the animators who bring some of the most impressive but also high concept cuts we've ever seen. Just even the ideas here are another level. This first person shot in the dark just blows my mind, like why they thought of doing something like that, as well as the sequences within the school at night. The infinity shot here by Yamasta is, well, in some ways prototyped within the show. The animation has never been this dynamic, as things push through the frame right into the front of the camera with its complicated perspective work and just how it is smoothly edited together. It's stylish, baby, and sometimes pushing it to the absolute limits of what you can get away with. Well, I think when we did Beautiful Dreamer, our relationship was definitely at its best. The friendship was very strong. They didn't know what I was trying to do half the time, but it seemed to be in sync with regards to writing and drawing. It worked especially well with planes, tanks, and cute things. We seemed to understand each other. All I had to say was, let's do something fun, or let's do something different. On that account, I think we were all blessed. It's definitely one of the happiest times for the director, as he would say himself. I think that happiness and enthusiasm would bleed through to the crew. But really, like everything else here, it's the sum of its parts. The images are nothing without the score. It's fairly sparse in comparison. It has a different energy. You have Katsuhoshi here, who took on the role of composer. He'd also worked prior for their partner in the double feature, P.P. Ryder. There's also a variety of instrumentation here. It can be classical in a way that the prior exclusively synthetic instrumentations can't be. Going from city pop summer all the way to antique show. The change in the composers fits the reflective tone of Hoshi, recalling that the director himself is pretty much exactly what he wanted. It can be grandiose and explosive with its bursts of orchestral music, but also really play to the ambience of a scene. It was basically a sort of late night mystery, that each part serves a purpose to move the story and the mystery forward, making you follow the roller coaster as you go. At its core, it was very much a meta-narrative about the crew's experience working on the show for about 2 years at that time. A constant repeat on loop, the endless everyday, which you were pushing against the walls until it all collapsed. They were working straight for a really long time, and I bet there was very few full nights of sleep. Ito, the screenwriter, had been blasting out scripts, but he kind of got burnt out. So then they basically got together in the little office and started rotating scripts. You do 4, I'll do 4, and move it through. Although Oshii had to stop doing that around episode 83, which would be around the start of the Beautiful Dreamer production. The television show structure seems to start falling apart at certain points, if that be animation quality, or just the sake that towards the end of the show, they start firing out a lot of recap episodes, so they have more time, effectively. And even one director was joking that episode 100 only had 2 characters because they just lacked the money or resources to keep the whole cast together or animate anything else. Great episode, though. It can't exactly be easy here because Oshii had 3 projects on the go. And this is a period where sacrifices needed to be made.
In the morning, he'd work on the TV show all the way to noon or the evening. Then he'd move and work on that all the way to midnight. Then he would go to this final production and do that all the way until dawn. Recipe for disaster, really. You can definitely see the parallels between Sensei and Oshii here in terms of the husk of a man they become. Even though I would say it's still clearer than episode 78. It has an answer and it has a conclusion. The only thing that really remains to be answered is if the dream ever ended. Beautiful Dream released on video and in the theatre on the same day. It didn't do as well in the theatre as they were hoping, and there's a kind of infamy around it in terms of the response to it, which is sometimes overplayed. I mean, after all, it actually did do pretty well on video. We're talking 35,000 copies sold, which is comparable to Nausicaa's 45,000 in the same year. That's not to say it didn't get some negative responses. They were always there, right? But no more than usual, I would say. The series has always had its vocal critics.
I had a lot of criticism for that at the time, especially from fans of the series. They'd say, Lum isn't doing anything, she's not playing a big role. I had to make the movie that way.
It still landed in Animage's top 3 of that year, and it basically made Oshii into a rock star anime director, even later being voted one of the top 10 anime films of all time in Cinema Junbo, which is one of the oldest movie magazines in the country. Now, sometimes the real drama brought up is about the relationship between Takahashi and Oshii, which Oshii himself does no favours with. He constantly overplays the relationship, which then Takahashi comes to come around and sort of deny and be like, no, it's not really like that, but you know, people like the drama, right?
There are rumours that we didn't get along, right? Though that's not true. Though society finds out way more interesting, so I don't correct them. When the DVD and Blu-rays came out, I'd be asked by others, are you okay with this? And I always respond with, what's wrong with it?
Ultimately, Oshii's Urusei Yatsura is one thing, and the manga is separate. Still, if you read the room, he'd went too far in a lot of places, and the producers kind of wanted him gone. After all, he was holding the movie and the series for ransom. The series itself had moved towards more and more original content towards the end, as they felt like they were running out of stories to use from the manga itself. Oshii's run ended on episode 106. As you said, I got my confidence in filmmaking skills, so I quit Pierrot and got married. Although there are other factors involved too. Ochi also said that Oshii told him he was so burnt out that he basically had to quit. He was not happy about this response and asked him, what are you, Ashton no Joe? Then Oshii would reply with something like that.